Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. This podcast is a bit later than normal because there was an important conference in Canberra on March the 31st that I'll come to in a moment. I'm covering a few things in this episode and I'll do the Australian topics in chronological order. The first was the Avalon Air Show last week, which I attended for all 3 of the working days. There were no major announcements. All Australian companies, large and small, noted a downturn in income and activity due to the shrinking defence spend. By the way, I didn't speak with every single company. There are about 400 there, but, a sort of rough sample. So the overall mood was a bit subdued, but not depressed. Anecdotally, I would say that each show I attend in all domains provides more evidence of moves to uncrewed autonomous systems and greater use of AI. There was a bit of discussion about the future structure of the Air Force and compliments to the Chief, Air Marshal Stephen Chappell, for actually speaking with the media. We had half an hour with him and had the opportunity to ask a variety of questions. I think I had 2. My first was about the recent Chinese warship circumnavigation of Australia and whether that provided a justification for moving from 4 Triton uncrewed aerial systems to 6. And just a reminder that the first Triton is in country, going through complex integration tests. Another 2 are under construction. They're due to arrive next year, I believe. They typically operate at more than 50,000 feet and in a 24-hour mission can monitor with radar and EO sea surface area equivalent in size to Western Australia. They have a wingspan about the size of a 737 and they fly at cruise at high subsonic speeds. Amazing surveillance tool. Anyway, the answer was that the 4 under contract is all that is planned for the moment, which might be a slight disappointment for prime contractor Northrop Grumman. The company is still hopeful for a long-term order of perhaps 7 of them. There were also many questions about the MQ-28 Ghost Bat, developed by Boeing Australia, uncrewed aerial system, and with the RAAF overwhelmingly positive about the program. Now, there's been a bit of media doom and gloom about it, which I don't share, and I'm not sure where the negativity is coming from. But after major trials later this year, basically trials simulating combat operations where Ghost Bat, either one or more, will be operating in conjunction with crewed aircraft, such as F-35s and Super Hornets, and surveillance assets such as Wedgetail. Now, assuming that those trials are successful, and all of the simulations so far have been very positive, as well as physical flights, the RAAF will go back to government, it's expected early next year, with a request to fund the next phase, which presumably will be some form of production contract. Also, special thanks to the Air Commander, Air Vice Marshal Glenn Braz, and the head of RAAF Capability, Air Vice Marshal Nick Hogan, despite the efforts of some in the media to unintentionally destroy his career. But before that, let's get to the substance. I asked about the future structure of the Air Force, what it would look like in 2035, and would it be substantially different from today? And the answer, everyone was being open and honest about it, was yes, well, with the addition of the Ghost Bat, the MQ-28A, presumably in significant numbers, that's going to affect the structure. But in terms of crewed platforms, no real changes, and this is my comment, not theirs, and that's because, of course, AUKUS funding for nuclear-powered submarines is eating up so much money that there just isn't that much left over. Now, On the matter of the unintentional destruction of Air Vice Marshal Hogan's career, and by the way, is a highly intelligent, very nice, very helpful person, so I feel quite bad about what happened, there were some headlines that people might have seen along the lines that RAAF welcomes the idea of additional F-35 aircraft. Now, the problem with that is that has been suggested by the federal opposition. We have an election campaign underway, and a possible interpretation would be, well, RAAF is endorsing the view of the coalition. No, that was not the case at all. I suspect that Air Vice Marshal Hogan would have received a few unpleasant phone calls. So let me explain the circumstances, because I was there. Now, he was asked about 3 or 4 times, each time in a slightly different way, about F-35s and about capability, and he was very careful on each occasion to commence his answer by saying, look, all of these decisions about force design are really matters for government, and we have a national defence strategy, and we have to follow along with that. All perfectly fair and reasonable. Then someone else tried their luck once again with a further question about F-35, and I think sort of to lighten the mood, or rather than just repeat himself for the 5th time, he used words to the effect of sort of, yes, well, if somebody wanted to give us more, that they'd be welcome, that sort of thing. So I thought that the way that it was reported was very unfair on Air Vice Marshal Hogan. If he or any of his staff are listening into this, I would like to apologise to them. Unfortunately, these things do sometimes happen in the media. There are a few of us who write for the more specialist publications who try very hard to be as factual as we can, but when some of my colleagues in the mainstream media, they look at it through a completely different prism, and if there's a chance to make something maybe, how do I put it discreetly, a little more exciting than it objectively deserves to be, they are under pressure from their editors to sex it up a bit. Anyway, hopefully the Air Vice Marshal has survived. Well, his career has survived, and I hope this doesn't discourage him from speaking with the media, though I fear the worst. I think after episodes like this, the understandable reaction of people in the military when they've had a bad experience is to go, oh no, I'm not going to risk ever doing it again, and therefore we won't be having any more sessions. I hope that I am wrong, but I fear for the worst. Now, before leaving the topic of the air show, please spare a thought for we hard-working journalists. The traffic back to the city is so awful, the city being Melbourne, that you can frequently see the location of the first of the cocktail functions for the evening, but it's incredibly frustrating knowing that it's going to take at least an hour to get to it. I cannot describe how my blood pressure is negatively affected by this. Oh, and I should also mention that the ABC's Andrew Green once again demonstrated his commitment to detail by initially trying to check into the wrong hotel. Now, next on the agenda, the federal budget last Tuesday night. And it was a major disappointment for anyone working in the defence and national security space, because there is no money there, just a re-announcement of supposedly an extra $1 billion a year that will barely cover the effects of inflation. And as far as I can tell, even this was announced last year, so we have to wait until the 2027-28 financial year for the start of any meaningful increase. So the presence of Chinese warships in our region and this huge issue of the United States proving that it is no longer a reliable ally has had zero impact on the thinking of our government. I might also say another personal disappointment for me, because this is in a related field, science, technology, research and development, zero extra dollars there either. So, folks, I don't think we're going in the right direction when it comes to defence expenditure, given Australia's deteriorating strategic circumstances and the unreliability of the country that, until now, has been a very strong ally of ours. Now, the conference that I referred to on Monday the 31st was organised by former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. It was a seminar to discuss AUKUS, the effect that that is having on Australia's security outlook, and also to consider the budgetary impacts of what is going on. It was flattering to be invited, as numbers were limited to 100, and I'm sure there are plenty of people around who know much more about submarines than me, because AUKUS Pillar 1 was was sort of the major focus. And Malcolm Turnbull decided to organise the event because he has previously and very publicly argued that AUKUS is not in Australia's national interests, because in the very unlikely event that the nuclear-powered submarines ever arrive, they will effectively be under American control and will be totally dependent on the US for support. Now, as regular listeners would know, or readers of APDR would know, my own perspective is similar, and I'm particularly hugely dismayed by the costs, which are just ballooning. And one line item in the budget, buried in the detail, was a $6 billion increase, that's billion with a B, in funding for AUKUS, moving from $12 billion to $18 billion. This is over the forward estimates, so that's the 3 years after next financial year. No explanation has been given for this 50% increase, and I don't expect it will ever be, because the government and the Australian submarine agencies simply do not answer questions. So to the seminar itself, I'll start with a summary. There was an overwhelming consensus that the US will not supply nuclear-powered Virginia-class submarines to Australia ever. Now, that might just reflect the overall structure of the crowd, because there are a lot of AUKUS doubters there, figures like former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans. Now, a much smaller number thought it would still happen, but accepted that it might be later, possibly much later, than the public 2032 arrival date. What I found interesting were, I guess, what you would call the more extreme views. Dennis Richardson, former Secretary of the Department of Defence, said that Malcolm Turnbull, he said this to his face, might be jinxing the whole thing by holding this seminar and being critical of the deal. And I've heard before, by the way, that somehow we must all just shut up, because if the Americans think we are doubting them, they will throw all of their toys out of the pram and refuse to cooperate. I don't know the Americans nearly as well as Dennis Richardson, but that seems unlikely to me. And in any case, the main issues are, touched on these before, one, the inability of US industry to construct Virginia-class submarines fast enough to have excess capacity for some to go to Australia, and a second requirement, that they can only be sold to Australia if they don't weaken the USN itself. The only way around the latter point from the American perspective would be to argue that the submarines are effectively part of the United States Navy, and we will do exactly as we are told, which gets back to the sovereignty argument, or lack of sovereignty. Professor Hugh White argued, I also know Hugh quite well, I thought fairly convincingly, that Donald Trump might have done Australia a favour by forcing us to realise that we are largely on our own. Not that you'll hear a word about that from either side of politics in this already dismal and inspiring election campaign, and I don't know about any of you, but for me the Food Network is on most of the time. Another contribution, a very important one, former submariner Peter Briggs, again very well known to many people, said that on current projections in the year 2031, when the transfer has to be authorised, I thought it might have been a year or two earlier, but Peter says 2031, the US will have in its inventory 31 Virginia-class submarines, 7 much older Los Angeles-class, and 3 aging Seawolves. So that's 41. Now, that's 41 out of an official requirement of 66. SSNs, which is obviously a shortfall of 25. How the US could transfer even one Virginia-class without detracting from their own capabilities is way beyond me and most other sane people. Anyway, with all of the intellectual horsepower in the room, no one could come up with a really convincing idea for a Plan B. According to former DMO head Kim Gillis, who has also worked for France's naval group, the idea of buying Suffren-class submarines instead, and they could hypothetically be built in Adelaide, won't work because the French are still so pissed off by the cancellation of the attack program. We will go to the back of a growing queue for nuclear-powered submarines. The French ambassador happened to be sitting at my table, and when I asked if he wanted to say something, he declined, which could be confirmation of Kim Gillis's perspective. Some people thought that we should be doing even more to make the Americans happy so that they would somehow relax about selling them to us. I don't accept that view at all, particularly under Trump. The US is completely transactional. My own little contribution, for what it was worth, was that since we won't get subs from the US or France, and the UK program is likely to be significantly delayed, we instead need to focus on uncrewed AI-enabled undersea drones. Quite a lot of work is happening on that in Australia. When I look or hypothesize about the late 30s and 2040s, my view is that technology is moving so fast that conflicts will be completely dominated by uncrewed systems. And now, it might sound like pick on Dennis Richardson Day, but I know from previous experience he can handle it. Plus, he's not really a podcast sort of person. He replied to this bit about uncrewed systems that the US would still have crewed SSBNs well into next century. That might well be true, but I'm not talking about replacing the functionality of ballistic missile firing submarines, because Australia will never acquire those, but instead of attack submarines. Plus, I can assure Dennis and everyone else that the USN does not and will never operate SSBNs in the South China Sea. It's a complete no-go area. Now, I'm going to finish up with a few words about Greenland. The situation is getting more absurd and truly dangerous, almost by the minute. This is the idea that Donald Trump keeps repeating, that he wants to take it over, if necessary, by military means. The creepy J.D. Vance and his wife visited, which was actually hilarious. Originally, they were hoping for some sort of PR stunt and wanted to meet with some locals, but none of the residents or local businesses wanted to have anything to do with them, so they instead went to a US base far in the north, or I should say even further in the north, for 2 hours, for the vice president to lie outrageously and say Denmark isn't protecting Greenland. Well, you moron, Denmark is part of NATO, so it's protected by the entire alliance. Competition for the Arctic is increasing, but the only threat to Greenland is Russia. The country doing its utmost to combat Russia right now is, class, guess, competition time. Who is fighting Russia right now? Yes, it's Ukraine. Who is trying to side with Russia and destroy Ukraine? It is, in fact, the Trump administration. And speaking of which, when you hear this podcast, it should be, in Donald Trump's words, Liberation Day, when all of his tariffs kick in and the trade war starts and the world plunges into recession or depression. Thank you for listening. I'll try and cheer you up next time. Bye for now.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.